In this video, I'm going to go over some basic elements of fiction so that as we read and talk about stories this semester, we'll have a shared language and be able to think about how the different parts of a story work together. But before we get to that part, I want to tell you something that will make your work in this class both easier and harder. And that is that I'm not interested in having you discover the one true meaning of any of the stories that we're reading this semester. Instead, what I am interested in is your interpretation of those stories, in what happens when you, an actual human person who lives in the world, brings your attention, your intelligence, and your feelings to a particular piece of fiction. In some of the stories you read this semester, you might find yourself identifying with the characters and relating to their experiences. But other stories might present you with people and places who feel completely foreign to you. As a student of literature, your job is to move past your initial reaction to a story and to think about how the different elements in the story are working together to create meaning. And that meaning doesn't happen without you. You, the reader, are constructing that meaning as you experience the story, using your knowledge of the world, your knowledge of how fiction works, and your experience. The flowchart version goes something like this. First, you read the story. You react to it. Maybe you love it. Great. Then you analyze the story and think about what it means. Or maybe you're not so lucky. You read the story, but you hate it, and you think it's boring or confusing. That's a bummer, but you still need to analyze the story and think about what it means. The good news is that as you experience the stories in this class, you're not trying to find the correct interpretation of what it means, so you can't be wrong. The flip side of that is that I do expect you to read each story with attention to detail and to really take some time to consider what you think about it. Character is probably the most essential element of fiction, right? Especially in literary fiction where the characters usually drive the action of the story. We have protagonists and antagonists. Protagonists are usually the main character. Antagonists usually work against the protagonist to create some kind of conflict. And all of this is driven by internal motivation. So what do these characters want? In addition to people, animals, objects, and places can also function as characters in a story. And there's lots of ways that we learn about who these characters are, right? So the author might tell us directly something about them. We learn about them through their words and their actions, to the way that other characters react to them and say things about them, and also their physical appearance and their thoughts, depending on the style of narration. If the narrator is a first-person narrator, they are telling the story directly, so we do probably get to hear their thoughts and what they're thinking, although not always. In a third-person limited narration, we only get to see what we can observe from the outside, so the author has chosen to use third-person pronouns, he, she, they, and we don't get to see any of their thoughts. Whereas with omniscient narration, we do get to see all of their thoughts, because then the narrator is like God, right? We get to sort of see what's happening and also to know the inner thoughts and feelings of all of the characters. Psychic distance is a concept that asks us to think about sort of the distance of the narrator emotionally or psychically to the story that they're telling. So, for example, if you were telling a story about something really emotional that happened to you yesterday, then that's a really close psychic distance. Whereas if you were telling a story about your grandfather's childhood, you have a greater psychic distance, right? You're like emotionally and psychically farther away from that story. And it's important to remember that we also will encounter this semester some unreliable narrators. You can't always trust the people who are telling you the story. So setting obviously is geographical location, but it also is the time period in which the story is set, the socioeconomic circumstances of the narrator and the characters in the story. And the setting creates the atmosphere of the story, right? So a story set in this castle, for example, would probably be a pretty different story than one set in an industrial warehouse or on a beach. It also shapes the characters, where the characters grew up, the environment that they lived in. It all tells us more about who they are as well. And the setting influences the plot and the events in the story. Different things happen in different places, right? A few other things to think about are plot, or the events that take place in a story, voice, tone, or mood, the style of a particular author or narrator that shapes the way a story feels, theme, the underlying idea of what a story is about that's bigger than plot, character, or setting, dialogue, or when characters talk to one another, which is usually noted in the story with quotation marks, but not always, verisimilitude, which means a semblance of truth, or the illusion of reality. It's that feeling that makes us believe that a story could be real even when we know it's not. Chronology and flashbacks, right? Even though we experience time as linear, doesn't mean that stories get told that way. We can move backward and forward in time in a story. Metaphorical language, or language that compares one thing to another and is not necessarily meant to be read literally. And satirical stories, which use humor, irony, or exaggeration to make a point about people or society. So I think that'll give us a pretty good foundation for talking about fiction this semester. These are all things to pay attention to as you're reading, right? And as you're taking notes in the margins and asking questions about how certain things are functioning within a story. One thing to try if you get stuck is to think about how the story would be different if any of these elements were different. How would the story be different if it was set in Spain instead of Massachusetts? How would the story be different if the main character's brother was telling the story? How would the story be different if it was a first-person narrator instead of third? So experiment with some of these things, think about them, see what kind of approach works well for you, and go read some fiction.